A reading from the letter to the Hebrews. Brothers and sisters, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us, and persevere in running the race that lies before us, while keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of faith. For the sake of the joy that lay before him, Jesus endured the cross, despising its shame, and has taken his seat at the right of the throne of God. Consider how he endured such opposition from sinners, in order that you may not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding blood. Verbum Domini. They will praise you, Lord, who long for you. I will fulfill my vows before those who fear him. The lowly shall eat their fill. They who seek the Lord shall praise him. May your hearts be ever merry. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nation shall bow down before him. To him alone shall bow down all who sleep in the earth. Before him shall bend all who go down into the dust. And to him my soul shall live, my descendants shall serve him. Let the coming generation be told of the Lord, that they may proclaim to a people yet to be born the justice he has shown.
Sicknesses away and carried our diseases for us. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Dominus vobiscum. Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Marcum.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she might get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately, her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. Verbum Domini.
Laus tibi Christe.
The reading from Hebrews 12 follows upon a long discussion throughout chapter 11 about the various Old Testament saints, those people who had lived faith. And he focused on Hebrews on the faith that they had in the face of the impossible, not unlike today's gospel. That this faith in God, when everything would seem to be impossible, is precisely what set apart Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the other people like Moses, and many that he can just barely touch on by name. And after having gone through this whole sense of them being filled with faith, he then opens up today's reading. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, these various saints of the Old Testament are the cloud of witnesses that he mentions. The idea of a group of people being a cloud is something that was a very common image in this period and much earlier. Even in the Iliad and the Odyssey, great crowds were called clouds of people because it shows their unity as a group. But also they're a cloud of witnesses. Witnesses, the Greek word for that is martyres, martyrs, because that's what the word martyr means, a witness. And they are not passive witnesses. Sometimes you see an accident or some other situation in which you're a passive witness. You see it, you didn't do anything, you couldn't do anything about it, you just happened to be there. That would be the kind of witness we're not talking about. This cloud of witnesses was very active in their faith. And they took a lot of action because of their faith. Abraham started a family. Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt. And so on. So being a witness is not a passive standing back and just watching. It's a very active involvement in the life of faith. And we should understand that these witnesses are very active. But because we have this active crowd of witnesses of faith, people who believe strongly, then we should be motivated. And he gives us an exhortation that they should motivate us. Let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us. The word for burden doesn't occur anywhere else in the New Testament, but it's something that was used in sports imagery. And that's what he's using here, is some sports imagery. He's especially thinking of the Roman and Greek games, where one of the most important of the games was the foot race. That was the game that began and as a matter of fact, at one point it was the only sport at the Olympics for a number of years. And at the other Pan-Hellenic Games, it was the main event. Let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us, like a runner is free of the burdens. You can't carry your lunch when you're running a race. You don't grab onto a lot of stuff and then try to run fast. You have to be unencumbered in order to run the race well. And that's why he said, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us. One of the things about running this race, as he'll say here, to persevere in running the race that lies before us. One of the things about running the race is that sin will slow us down. And there's no sin that's going to help us run the race. Being free of all sin is part of the task that we have. And this is one of the things that will certainly help us to lose the race if we're encumbered by sin. Now, some people would say, well, what about just a little venial sin or two? That's okay, isn't it? No, it's not okay. No sin is okay. And no sin helps us win the race to get to heaven, because that's what is at stake. And that's one of the things he wants us to keep in mind. You persevere in running the race that lies before us while keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of our faith. Jesus is called the prodromos, the forerunner. In a race, that title was given to the person who broke out at the beginning of the race and was ahead of the rest of the group. The person who would be the leader of the pack of runners. That would be the prodromos, and that's Christ. He's the one who runs the race ahead of us. And to know where we're going and to keep pace, we follow Jesus. He's the one that sets the pace and the norm for all of us. And it's not going to be looking back. If you're looking back in a race, two things will happen. First, you're keeping your eyes on the loser. Secondly, every time a person turns back in a race, they lose time. You don't go ahead by seeing who's behind you. You lose time by looking back because you're not paying attention to where you're going. And this is one of the things that he wants us to do, is keep our eyes on Jesus Christ. And notice that he just says, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. He just mentions the holy name to emphasize that it's Christ who, at the beginning of this letter, back in chapter 2 and 3, was emphasized as being human. Chapter 1 emphasized Christ's divinity. Chapter 2 and 3 emphasizes humanity. And both are true realities. But we focus here on his humanity because he runs the race like we did. And the finish line is not a ribbon that you break through. The finish line is death itself. and you break that barrier of death. And so Christ did exactly that. For the sake of the joy that lay before him, Christ knew that there was a joy that would lie ahead of winning this race. And because he knew that, he was willing to endure the cross and despise its shame. When somebody was crucified, the man in charge was called the lictor. And he would be told, "Lictor, cover the head of the prisoner and take him to his shame and put him on the tree." So that the very nature of the crime was considered to be shameful. It was a death that was given to slaves. It was not the death of a free man. And so there was shame involved in the death on the cross. And Jesus despises that shame. He looks down upon it. That's what the word that means here, to despise is shame. He looks down upon it. He doesn't allow the shame of dying on the cross to stop him. And as a result, he has taken a seat at the right of the throne of God, so that Christ ascends to the right hand of the Father over and over again throughout this letter, beginning in chapter 1, chapter 5, and other places. He keeps on quoting Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, "Sit at my right until I make your enemies your footstool." Christ sits at the right hand of God the Father because he did not allow the shameful and painful death of dying on the cross to stop him from completing the race. Now, if Christ doesn't allow the cross to stop him, neither should we allow ourselves to be stopped from running the race. And we don't give ourselves permission for any kind of sin. See, that's one of the things that can easily go on. We can slip into giving ourselves permission to commit sin because, well, everybody else is doing it, and it's not as bad as what some people are doing. It could be worse. I could do it more often, and a wide variety of other ways in which we give ourselves permission. And we're to not give ourselves permission, but rather to have a sense of taking all of those encumbrances of sin, all those burdens of sin, and getting rid of them, and not carrying any of them in the race, so that our life needs to be one of purification, so that we can run the race. And this image, purification, usually indicates some sort of cleansing. But here, it's the removal of burdens. That's the way that we want to see it, so that we can run this race, keeping our eyes on Jesus. Keeping our eyes on Jesus. He also asks us and exhorts us to consider how Jesus endured such opposition from sinners. He was at the cross, not being cheered on, but jeered at. People were jeering at him, calling him names, mocking his powers. You cured others, now come down off that cross yourself. They would make fun of him and mock him. This is what Christ endured on the cross. And he did that in order that you may not grow weary and lose heart. It's easy in the face of a lot of opposition to the faith to lose heart and not allow ourselves to keep the focus on Christ. It's easy to turn away our attention at those who are making fun of us, cheering for the other side. Again, in the race, you have people cheering for somebody and cheering against somebody else. And we'll be doing that in the Super Bowl in a few days. People will be in favor of one team or against another. And you boo for one and you cheer for the other. Well, who's booing us? It's not going to be those on God's side. It's not going to be the cloud of witnesses who had faith in God. It's going to be those from the other side. Those on the side of Satan and evil. They'll be booing us. And they'll be trying to dissuade us from finishing the race. And we ourselves can't allow that to happen. We don't want to lose heart. We don't want to grow weary and give up before the race is over. Especially after we've made a good start. We want to be able to complete it. And he even mentions to them, in your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding blood. It's not gotten that bad yet. Now, if this letter is written to the Jewish Christians of Rome, as I suspect that it is, they had suffered already. They had been persecuted somewhat by having property confiscated. He mentions that in the letter. They had property confiscated, and some of them were put in jail. But nobody had shed their blood yet. If this is written in the early 60s, again as I suspect, then by the late 60s, they would be shedding their blood under Nero. But they had not yet suffered that much. But even in the midst of shedding blood, we have to stay firm and keep our way forward. Now, just in terms of today's gospel reading, I'd want to mention this. The issue, both for the woman with the hemorrhage and for Jairus, is also faith. Having faith in Christ and in his power is another element for all of us. And I would just draw one small lesson from the woman. It's one of my favorite stories of the woman with the hemorrhage who touched the tassel of Jesus' garment. There's this crowd that is bustling about, and they're pushing against Jesus and trying to touch him, and they're all surrounding him. And yet he feels one woman touch him, even though all these other people are touching him too. What made the difference? Her faith. Her faith. He could detect that she had faith, and that as a result of her faith, power went out from him. We can learn something from her in regard to the sacraments. One of the temptations is to come to the sacraments and touch Jesus, touch him in the Eucharist, and be like the crowd who just bustles in front and tries to get a hold of Jesus, touch him, and so on. But who don't allow the power of Jesus to go out from the sacraments into them. Rather, we can see that we should be like the woman and approach the sacraments, approach the Holy Eucharist with her kind of faith, expecting Christ to act for us, expecting Jesus to do something for us. And as we touch him and receive him on our tongues and allow him to come into our hearts, that we are doing this with faith, that he will make life better for us. He will improve our spiritual life, give us the strength to run this race. He will give us the power to get rid of the burdens of sin. He will act within us in powerful ways. And even though it's always Jesus, just as in this gospel story, it was the true Jesus that they were touching. But when they did not have faith, it made no effect on them. Jesus could not help them so also with us. As we come to him, let us ask him to give us greater faith, so that our contact with him in the Holy Eucharist and all the other sacraments would be such that he would heal us and change us and do what nature and the doctors can't do, and give us a wholeness that is his gift to us.